They sent fake cops to my porch, and for a moment, just a hot, awful second, I believed they might take my home while I stood in my own doorway. A woman in a tailored dress, smiling like a queen, read a piece of paper like it was scripture and said, "He has to go," and two young men with shiny badges that didn't belong to any county I'd ever worked with looked at me as if my birth certificate were a rumor. That's how it started, with a thin lie spoken on the phone, and the kind of entitlement that sounds polite until it isn't. I'm Daniel Hayes. For 30 years, I wore a robe in court and thought I knew people's worst impulses. I thought I knew the shape of bullying. I lived on Raven Ridge Ranch with my wife Elena's roses and an old German Shepherd Rex who knew the difference between a threat and the wind. The ranch wasn't a luxury. It was memory planks we built one by one over a lifetime, and the would-be thief of it wore a smile and a name tag, Margaret Blake, president of Willow Creek HOA. She began with the letters that smelled like polished official-looking envelopes, bold font, a list of violations that read like someone paging through a grudge. "Dust from my gravel driveway," she said. "Unapproved landscaping, unregistered outbuildings." She emailed, neighbors started a private Facebook thread, and in between sent a man to measure the roses like he was taking inventory. It's amazing how quickly a person can make an entire neighborhood believe in a story if they tell it loudly enough. Her son, Ethan, posted a selfie in front of a truck and called the Landars like saying it made it true. Then came the call that changed everything. Someone acting, scared breath sharp, calling 911 to report a hostile man occupying my son's property. The dispatcher asked if he was armed. The voice that I later learned belonged to Margaret went cold and clipped. "He's threatening my son's inheritance." That single line turned my name into the word squatter. I was on my porch reading Marcus Aurelius' Sunlight thinning into amber, and I heard tires. Tires crunching. Two men knocked flat, non-negotiable knocks, and a white SUV with a black stripe and the words Community Compliance Division crawled up my lane like a joke that had gone too far. I opened the door. They stood there in uniforms that looked like they might have been ordered from a costume catalog, badges too. Bright boots, too new. Behind them, Margaret watched, arms folded as if she'd already seen the verdict written in the wind. "You need to vacate immediately," the taller one said, voice trained to sound like an authority even when it isn't. "We have a complaint. I asked for papers." She handed me an enforcement notice with a logo I'd never seen and signatures that trembled under scrutiny. I told them the deed date 1971, and that every fence, every rosebush had a recorded history long before Willow Creek had a name. The boys shifted. Margaret's smile thinned. She said words I recognized from too many board meetings. The HOA voted. They had the arrogance of people who think meeting minutes are law. My heart didn't pound. I'd spent a career listening to bluster, but I felt it like a coldness the way a door slams on a quiet room. The scene never escalated into violence because a different set of tires, heavy, steady, rolled into view. Interceptor engine. Sheriff Tom Willis stepped out, the kind of man I'd sworn in years ago, broad-shouldered, hat in hand, recognition washing over his face like a slow tide. The sheriff's eyes went flat, then wide, then regretful in a way that made Margaret falter. She tried to reclaim her script. He's been warned, he's been cited, but... Sheriff Willis looked at the two officers and said calmly, "Who are you with?" Neither of them had an answer that matched the uniforms on their backs. I watched her face lose its color. You could almost see the math of entitlement miscalculate into panic. He told her there was no legal standing to remove me, that the documents she presented were not court orders, that the badges weren't county-issued. He asked me my name, and in the way of old colleagues, we both took a breath of recognition. It was the best kind of small mercy public correction, but it wasn't the end. Margaret retreated for now, but she hadn't stopped. That was the first act, a quiet, ugly show of power mailers, bogus notices, pressure on neighbors and me, Daniel Hayes holding my porch like a last line of defense. But the second act is where the mind begins to erode. She doubled down. Emails became louder. A smear campaign on neighborhood forums painted my property as hazardous, dangerous a liability. Small businesses on the lane got calls. Contractors worried about being associated with that judge's property. A bank asked for clarifications after a call alleging disputes over ownership. Someone in the HOA posted a doctored photo of my barn as unsafe structure. They made paperwork look like law. I began to doubt the neatness of deeds to reread signatures at night to hold Rex's head in my lap and ask him if I was being paranoid, and for the first time in years asked myself if I'd missed a filing a renewal. Something stupid. There were late nights with a lamp and a drawer of files, the kind of nights that grind patience into dust. I remember a moment when the room felt too small and the roses outside looked like accusations. I thought briefly of selling the place, of walking away so a neighbor wouldn't have to deal with the fallout. The thought was like a knife, simple and traitorous. But just when that urge pressed close, something else happened, the thing that changed the story's direction. Sheriff Willis came back with questions he hadn't had before. A neighbor, George, handed me his security footage showing the white SUV's plate partial and the truck that had come before the one Ethan had driven when he'd chopped at Elena's roses like they were a provocation instead of a memory. A county clerk confirmed the signature on a transfer Margaret had waived like proof was in fact forged. My lawyer, Tom, a friend from before the bench, told me to stop playing defense and start building the record, every letter, every voicemail, every post on the HOA's page. We filed complaints, false reports, impersonation, conspiracy. The turning point wasn't cinematic fireworks, it was paperwork and patience, and the quiet satisfaction of evidence lining up like dominoes. Then, the confrontation, real loud, undeniable. Margaret returned, filing in like a storm with Ethan at her side and those same two young men squaring their shoulders as if to enforce what paper could not. Sheriff Willis, this time with deputies, stepped onto my porch. He flipped through files like someone reading the margin notes of arrogance and found the lie in plain print. He turned to Margaret and said the words I'd wanted to say for months. "You filed a false report. These men are impersonating officers." She snapped. "I'm protecting the community," she cried, theatrical, which made the sheriff's expression all the angrier, not at me, at the idea of someone weaponizing community for personal gain. For a second, I watched her try and fail to rewind the narrative. The mask of entitlement cracked. The deputies moved with the professional quiet of men who do this for a living. They cuffed her gently, read her rights. Ethan lunged, and a deputy's hand stopped him enough force to make a point, not a spectacle. There was a sound the day Margaret had been led away that I won't forget, the click of cuffs on the porch rail, softer than a gunshot, louder than any shouted victory. I felt no triumph. Not really, only an exhaustion that smelled like rain. The HOA's files were opened. Their ledger showed odd disbursements. Their enforcement division dissolved under scrutiny. Margaret faced charges. Ethan faced restitution and community service. The board that had fed her authority disintegrated in public records because it turns out a lot of public cruelty doesn't survive daylight. I'd wanted to be careful. I'd wanted to let the law do its patient work, and it did. I wasn't a hero. I was a man who kept his papers tidy and knew how to wait. Standing on my porch after they left Rex's head on my knee, I thought of Elena's roses, the way she'd say, "Roses don't quit. They grow around the pain." The roses had been cut, bruised, but not dead, and neither was the thing they tried to take. There's no epilogue of parades or hugs here. I closed my door with the quiet of someone who's seen a crooked thing set straight. Justice didn't shout. It arrived methodical and patient. The lesson is simple: power without accountability is a loud thing. Truth, when documented and persistent, is louder. Truth endures.